Welcome back to Serial Sleep, where we delve into true crime stories to accompany you into a hopefully restful slumber. Before I move on to some less heard about killers, tonight we explore the life and crimes of Sean Vincent Gillis, known as the other Baton Rouge serial killer. At his time of operating, more focus was directed to unsolved cases of murdered women following the high-profile arrest of Derek Todd Lee on May 27, 2003. Lee's capture brought relief to many, but it also raised new questions for investigators. As they re-examined the evidence, certain cases remained unlinked to Lee's known crimes, prompting a chilling realization: another predator may have been operating in the shadows. Further investigations revealed that Baton Rouge had been the hunting ground for not just one but multiple serial killers. While Lee's killing spree began in 1992, the years between 1994 and 2003 saw two additional killers silently preying on women. Among them was Sean Vincent Gillis, whose gruesome crimes coincided with Lee's reign of terror, creating an overlapping timeline of fear and death. This horrifying revelation underscored the sheer complexity of the cases and the challenges investigators faced as they worked to identify and stop the culprits behind these heinous acts. "It was like they were already dead to me," said Sean Gillis, a chilling admission that offers a glimpse into the mind of one of Baton Rouge's most notorious serial killers. Unlike his counterpart, Derek Todd Lee, who targeted successful working-class women at random, Sean Gillis preyed on sex workers aged between their late 20s and early 50s, often involved in the drug underworld. However, Gillis deviated from his typical victim profile twice. 81-year-old Anne Bryan, a retired elderly woman, and 52-year-old Hardy Schmidt, who lived in an affluent Baton Rouge neighborhood and became a target only because Gillis spotted her jogging. His gruesome methods escalated over time. While he initially stabbed his victims, he later began strangling them to death with a zip tie. Many of his victims were found undressed, mutilated post-mortem, with some body parts severed. Hattie Schmidt's case was particularly brutal. She was struck with a car before being attacked. Gillis's modus operandi was as unpredictable as his choice of victims. He often mutilated the bodies and kept body parts as trophies, a hallmark of his crimes. While strangulation became his preferred method, he also frequently used a knife to stab his victims to death. Gillis defied the conventional FBI serial killer profile by crossing boundaries of age, race, and socioeconomic status. His victims ranged from 29 to 82 years old, included both white and black women, and came from diverse backgrounds. Some from impoverished neighborhoods, others from more affluent areas. These inconsistencies, combined with long, cooling-off periods between murders, likely contributed to his ability to evade capture for so long. DNA evidence linked Gillis to several of his victims, and unique tire tracks at a crime scene provided further incriminating proof. In total, Gillis confessed to 8 murders, his chilling confessions offering harrowing insights into his psyche. He referred to the nylon zip tie he used to strangle his victims as the objectifier, claiming it transformed them from a woman into an object I would then deal with. For Gillis, the act of killing seemed secondary to the perverse satisfaction he derived from manipulating his victims' bodies post-mortem. Sean Gillis's crimes remain some of the most horrifying in Baton Rouge's history, a macabre reminder of the predator who lived among the city's residents undetected for far too long. Sean Vincent Gillis, also known as the other Baton Rouge killer, is one of the most chilling figures in American criminal history. His crimes, which included necrophilia, cannibalism, and serial assault, coincided with those of another infamous Baton Rouge killer, Derek Todd Lee. The lives of Gillis's victims were tragically cut short between 1994 and 2003, leaving an indelible mark on Louisiana's capital city. Born on June 24, 1962, Sean Vincent Gillis came into a troubled household. His father, Norman Gillis, battled alcoholism and mental illness, which severely strained his relationship with his wife Yvonne and their young son. Norman's instability reached a terrifying peak when he once held a gun to Sean's head. Shortly afterward, Norman left the family, cycling in and out of mental institutions. Yvonne, left to raise Sean alone, worked tirelessly at a local TV station. Despite her challenges, she was a devoted mother who, along with Sean's paternal grandparents, provided him with a stable and nurturing environment. Gillis had a good relationship with his mother, who doted on him, and his grandparents played an active role in his upbringing. Age 10, Sean and his mother moved to a new neighborhood. Neighbors described him as a bit of a bully, though he maintained a relatively normal childhood. Von prioritized education and enrolled him in Catholic schools, hoping to instill discipline and values. Sean attended high school, but his grades were average, and he showed little interest in academics. During adolescence, Gillis and two close friends became fascinated with the occult, often observing satanic rituals for the thrill. They also smoked marijuana and engaged in minor delinquent behavior. At 17, Sean reunited with his estranged father, and the two formed a close bond. However, the relationship soured when Sean discovered Norman's homosexuality through a collection of explicit photographs. This revelation deeply disturbed him. After graduating high school, Gillis worked at Southland Corporation, moving between 7-Eleven convenience stores. However, he found little fulfillment in his job and preferred spending time on his computer. He developed an obsession with pornography, particularly graphic material involving the assault, death, and dismemberment of women. This fixation consumed his life, causing him to neglect his job and other responsibilities. In 1992, Yvonne relocated to Atlanta for a new job and invited Sean to join her. When he refused, she left him behind but continued paying the mortgage on their home. Now, living alone, Gillis's behavior became increasingly erratic. Neighbors noticed him howling at the sky, cursing his mother, and acting suspiciously, such as peeping into a female neighbor's window under the pretense of searching for his cat. In 1994, Gillis began dating Terry Lemoyne, a woman he met through a mutual friend. Despite his underachieving nature and heavy drinking, Terry found him kind and considerate. He even helped him secure a job at the convenience store where she worked. However, their relationship was marred by his lack of interest in sex, which Terry attributed to his addiction to pornography. Unbeknownst to her, Gillis's fixation on violent and degrading pornography had escalated to real-life violence. In March 1994, he committed his first murder, brutally killing 81-year-old Anne Bryan. This marked the beginning of a gruesome killing spree that would span nearly a decade. Between 1994 and 2003, Sean Vincent Gillis murdered and mutilated 8 women in and around Baton Rouge. His crimes were marked by their brutality and his shocking confessions of necrophilia and cannibalism. Despite his horrific actions, Gillis managed to evade detection for years, overshadowed by Derek Todd Lee, another active Baton Rouge serial killer. Gillis was finally apprehended in 2004 when DNA evidence linked him to his crimes. During his interrogation, he provided chillingly detailed accounts of his murders, confessing to the unspeakable acts he had committed. In 1992, at the age of 30, Sean Gillis found himself in trouble with the law when he was caught peeping into a neighbor's window. He claimed that he was simply looking for his missing cat, but his suspicious behavior led the police to be called. When they arrived, they discovered outstanding warrants for traffic violations and he was promptly arrested. However, Gillis was released soon after, as the traffic offenses didn't warrant prolonged detention. This was one of many small, troubling incidents that would later paint a clearer picture of his unsettling behavior. 2 years later, in 1994, at the age of 31, Sean met Terry Lemoyne, a woman who worked at a local business. After a brief acquaintance, Sean asked her out on a date and they soon began a romantic relationship. However, things took a tense turn early on. During an argument, Terry slapped Sean, an act that seemed to provoke an emotional breakdown in him. Rather than retaliating, Sean began crying uncontrollably. Terry, feeling remorseful for what had transpired, quickly apologized, and the couple made a pact that there would be no violence in their relationship moving forward. This emotional moment seemed to deepen their bond, and they became serious about one another in the following months. Sean Vincent Gillis once claimed he began killing as a way to cope with stress. His first known murder, which he confessed to following his arrest, was that of 81-year-old Anne Bryan on March 21, 1994. Bryan lived at St. James Place, an exclusive retirement home in Baton Rouge. According to Gillis, she had left her door unlocked, as was her habit, to allow her nurse easy access for a morning visit. Gillis entered Bryan's apartment during the early morning hours. Initially, he attempted to essay her, but when she screamed as he touched her, he panicked. To silence her, Gillis used a foot-long hunting knife to slash her throat and then stabbed her repeatedly, nearly decapitating and disemboweling her. Her body was left at the scene, where it was discovered later that morning by her nurse, who arrived for a routine checkup. The brutal murder shocked even the most seasoned investigators, who struggled to identify a motive or suspect. And Bryan's case remained unsolved for a decade. In his confession, Gillis provided investigators with details about the crime that only the killer could have known. The warrant described how he recounted entering Bryan's apartment and attacking her in graphic detail. Gillis's choice of Bryan as a victim seemed opportunistic. The retirement home was located across the street from the convenience store where he worked. Anne Bryan was described as a kind woman with a loving family, well respected by those who knew her, making her murder all the more incomprehensible. At the time of the murder, Gillis's criminal history consisted primarily of minor infractions, including trespassing, traffic violations, a DUI, a possession of marijuana, and contempt of court. Despite his history, police had no indication that he was capable of such a heinous act until his confession years later. Following Bryan's murder, Gillis's life continued outwardly as normal. He moved in with his girlfriend Terry the following year. Over time, Terry became aware of his addiction to pornography, but chose to ignore it, not realizing the extent of its depravity. She even dismissed her disgust when Gillis showed her pictures of dead women, remaining in the relationship despite these warning signs. The murder of Anne Bryan marked the beginning of Gillis's deadly spree, but it would take years and additional victims before authorities would finally uncover the full extent of his crimes. In 1994, at 32 years old, Sean Gillis's relationship with Terry Lemoyne began to show signs of strain. Terry became increasingly upset as she discovered Sean's drinking habits, which seemed to be escalating. She also learned that his mother was still financially supporting him, sending him money and further enabling his dependency. Despite these troubling revelations, Terry worked to help Sean turn things around. She eventually managed to get him a job at the convenience store where she worked, hoping it would give him some direction and stability. By 1995, Sean and Terry had moved in together. While the move was meant to bring them closer, it didn't solve all their problems. Terry had become frustrated by the lack of intimacy in their relationship, as they had only been intimate a few times during their time together. When they moved in, she was further disturbed to discover Sean's addiction to pornography. Although it deeply bothered her, she ultimately chose to ignore the issue, hoping that things would improve. Later that same year, Sean introduced Terry to a disturbing website featuring pictures of dead women. Terry was repulsed by the content, but Sean found it amusing and laughed at her reaction. Once again, Terry chose not to confront him about it, dismissing the issue in an attempt to avoid further conflict. At this point, the warning signs were there, but Terry, like many others in Sean's life, either overlooked or misinterpreted them. After a cooling off period of nearly 5 years, Sean Vincent Gillis struck again. On January 4th, 1999, he ended his hiatus, later admitting that his return to killing was driven by boredom. During the intervening years, Gillis had been living a seemingly quiet life in a small ranch-style house on Bergen Avenue, a mile from the scene of his first murder. He shared the home with his girlfriend after his mother relocated to Atlanta. Despite unassuming outward life, neighbors found him unsettling. Some described him as strange, and women in the area were particularly wary of him. Gillis's second victim was 30-year-old Catherine Hall, a known sex worker and drug addict who lived in a North Street housing project notorious for its crime and poverty. Gillis lured Hall into his car on a cold January night, initially attempting to strangle her with a zip tie. When she resisted and tried to escape, he stabbed her 16 times, cutting her jugular vein and inflicting a fatal wound to her throat. After her death, Gillis mutilated Hall's body, stabbing her an additional 21 times post-mortem. Her nude, butchered body was later discovered by a squirrel hunter in a rural area of East Baton Rouge Parish, positioned grotesquely beneath a dead-end sign. This macabre staging led investigators to believe the placement may have been a darkly symbolic act on Gillis's part. The scene was described as particularly disturbing, with Hall's body displayed in what one observer referred to as a balletic pose. Former District Attorney Prem Burns remarked on the sick irony of the staging, calling it his humor in a very sick kind of way. Hall's jacket was found miles away from the crime scene, hanging near the levee by LSU. DNA evidence later linked Gillis conclusively to her murder. The autopsy report revealed the full extent of Gillis's violence. In addition to the fatal wounds inflicted while Hall was alive, her body bore signs of necrophilia and post-mortem mutilation, underscoring the rage and depravity that fueled his crimes. The brutal murder of Catherine Hall marked a significant escalation in Gillis's killing spree. Her high-risk lifestyle made her vulnerable, but the shocking violence of her death highlighted the deep-seated rage driving her killer. In May 1999, Sean Gillis began stalking 52-year-old Heidi Schmidt, a mother of 3 and avid runner who had previously participated in the Boston Marathon. He first noted Schmidt jogging in her well-to-do South Baton Rouge neighborhood and quickly identified her as a potential victim. Over the course of 3 weeks, Gillis repeatedly returned to her neighborhood hoping to encounter her again. On Sunday, May 30th, 1999, at approximately 6:30 a.m., Gillis saw Schmidt jogging along Quail Run Drive. Seizing the opportunity, he used his car to run her down, striking her and knocking her into a ditch. Dazed and injured, Schmidt was unable to defend herself as Gillis approached with a heavy-duty cable tie. He placed the tie tightly around her neck, choking her until she was subdued. Gillis then forced Schmidt into his car and drove to a secluded park off Highland Road, where he brutally assaulted and murdered her. After the attack, Gillis mutilated Schmidt's body with a knife before placing her nude corpse into the trunk of his white Chevy Cavalier. Her body remained there overnight as Gillis continued about his day. The following morning, he drove to St. James Parish, approximately 35 miles from Baton Rouge, and disposed of Schmidt's body in a bayou near Highway 61. Her remains were discovered the next day by a bicyclist. Heidi Schmidt's disappearance and murder sent shockwaves through the community. A beloved mother and respected member of her neighborhood, her violent death starkly contrasted with the quiet life she had led. Gillis later confessed to the crime, detailing the horrifying sequence of events that ended Schmidt's life and left her family and community devastated. On November 12, 1999, Sean Gillis claimed the life of 36-year-old Joyce Williams, a woman who had been seen leaving a home on Oriel Street in Baton Rouge earlier that day. After luring her into his car, Gillis strangled Williams with a zip tie, his signature method of killing. However, what followed would mark one of the most gruesome chapters in his series of murders. Gillis brought Williams' lifeless body back to his home, where he carried out acts of unimaginable brutality. He mutilated her body, severing one of her legs and cutting off other body parts. For the first time, Gillis engaged in cannibalism, consuming portions of her flesh, including her nipples. As chilling as these acts were, Gillis's disturbing behavior did not end there. He picked up his girlfriend Terry from work that same day, with Williams's body hidden in the back seat of his car. Terry remained completely unaware of the horror concealed just behind her. Later that night, Gillis drove to a remote area in Iberville Parish on the east bank of the Mississippi River, about 3 miles south of the Plaquemine Ferry. There he dumped Williams's mutilated remains, leaving them to be discovered months later. On January 22, 2000, hunters stumbled upon a severed leg bone in a wooded area near the river. Deputies were called to the scene and discovered the rest of her skeleton approximately 700 feet away. Though her remains were identified as Joyce Williams shortly after their discovery, it would take 4 more years before Sean Gillis confessed to her murder. His chilling admission, coupled with the evidence found at the scene, solidified the link between Gillis and Williams's untimely and brutal death. In January 2000, Sean Vincent Gillis targeted 52-year-old Lillian Robinson, a woman known to frequent the streets of Baton Rouge. Gillis lured her into his car, where he strangled her to death. After her murder, he brought her body back to his home, but due to time constraints, his girlfriend Terry was about to finish work. He was unable to carry out the extensive mutilation he had inflicted on some of his previous victims. Instead, he engaged in necrophilic acts, including forcing himself upon her lifeless body. With little time to spare, Gillis transported Robinson's naked body to a remote area in the Atchafalaya Basin on February 10, 2000. A fisherman discovered her remains along Interstate 10, between the Whiskey Bay and Butler Rose exits. The grim discovery shocked authorities, who later linked the crime to Gillis through his chilling confession. Robinson's death marked Gillis's 5th known murder, adding another tragic victim to his horrifying spree. In late October 2000, Sean Gillis claimed his 6th victim, 38-year-old Marilyn Nevels. While visiting his goddaughter Christine in New Iberia, Gillis reportedly spotted Nevels and targeted her as his next victim. Nevels, a sex worker, was killed in the same brutal manner as his previous victims, strangled to death. After murdering her, Gillis took her body back to his home, where he engaged in further disturbing behavior, including showering with her corpse. He later transported Neville's body to a levee near the Mississippi River in Baton Rouge, leaving it exposed without any attempt to conceal it. Her decomposed remains were discovered by a passerby on Halloween, 3 miles from Gillis's house. Neville's wasn't known to be missing until Gillis's eventual confession tied him to her murder. Following Neville's killing, Gillis took a significant break from murdering, lasting over a year. During his hiatus, a new wave of brutal crimes began to emerge in Baton Rouge. In September 2001, Gina Wilson Green was murdered, and the following May, Charlotte Murray Pace was found stabbed to death in her home near Louisiana State University. 2 months later, Pam Cunamore was abducted from her home and her body was discovered days later in Whiskey Bay. By August 2002, the Baton Rouge Police Department recognized the presence of another serial killer. A task force was formed to solve these murders, but the focus primarily shifted to this second killer, leaving Gillis's crimes largely unnoticed. Gillis, aware of the competition, began obsessively tracking the case online. He followed news about the second killer, later identified as Derek Todd Lee, a 34-year-old ex-convict. Lee's victims included Trinisha Dene Colom and Carrie Lynn Yoder, and DNA evidence linked him to several of the murders. Like Gillis, Lee defied profiling norms by crossing racial boundaries in his choice of victims. The odds of two serial killers operating in the same area at the same time baffled authorities. After Lee's arrest in May 2003, he was dubbed the Baton Rouge Serial Killer, a title that infuriated Gillis. In response, Gillis created a folder on his computer labeled DTL, Lee's initials, where he collected articles and photos about Lee's crimes, determined not to be overshadowed by his rival. In October 2003, Sean Gillis resumed his murderous spree. This time, his victim was 45-year-old Johnny Mae Williams, a divorced mother of 3 who had battled addiction and occasionally worked as a sex worker. Johnny Mae was a beloved figure in her community, a skilled cook and hairstylist who often helped friends and neighbors. Tragically, her descent into addiction would lead her into Gillis's path. Unlike most of his victims, Johnny Mae wasn't a stranger to Gillis. The two had known each other for over a decade, having met through the store where Gillis worked. He even cleaned his house occasionally to earn extra money. Despite their familiarity, Gillis picked her up on the street one October evening, driving her to a secluded area where he unleashed his dark impulses. Gillis brutally beat, assaulted, and strangled Johnny Mae before mutilating her body with a knife. He also posed her lifeless body in degrading positions and photographed her, behavior that revealed his need for control and the twisted souvenirs he craved. Her remains weren't discovered until 9 months later, when a young boy riding 4-wheelers stumbled upon them near Pride Port Hudson Road. Johnny Mae's body was left exposed on an embankment, save for a jacket draped over her torso. When investigators removed it, they found her hands had been severed at the wrist, a chilling echo of Catherine Hall's murder. The autopsy revealed Johnny Mae had died from blunt force trauma, and her body bore extensive post-mortem injuries inflicted below the waist. Gillis later confessed to removing her hands and keeping them as trophies. Police linked her murder to Gillis through DNA evidence, but at the time of her discovery, law enforcement already recognized the work of a highly organized and sadistic killer. Forensic details painted a grim portrait of a man with a clear and escalating pattern of violence, a predator who had finally turned his brutality towards someone he knew. Donna Bennett Johnston, at 43 years old, struggled with addiction that kept her on the streets in search of her next high. However, as her son Justin would later describe, despite her struggles, she was still a mother. She was a great person, a great mother. Everything she did with her whole heart and soul. She loved people deeply. She would call me just to remind me that she loved me, he said. Though she would disappear at times, her family always held on to the hope that one day she would find a way out of her addiction. On February 27, 2004, 2 people searching for their lost dog came upon the body of a woman lying face down in a ditch near a drainage canal south of Louisiana State University. The body had been strangled and was left on display, with a jacket draped over her right arm. Upon removing the jacket, they discovered a gruesome sight. The killer had severed her left arm at the elbow. Further inspection revealed a 3 by 3-inch section of her tattoo was missing, taken by the killer. Donna Bennett Johnston was the 8th and final victim of the notorious serial killer Sean Vincent Gillis, also known as the other Baton Rouge serial killer. In February 2004, Gillis picked up Johnston, a 43-year-old sex worker, while she was intoxicated. According to his later confession, her death was swift. Within about a minute and a half, Johnston lost consciousness, and soon after, her life. Her final words, he claimed, were, "I can't breathe." After killing her, Gillis didn't stop there. He brutally mutilated Johnston's body, slashing her breasts and cutting off her left nipple, removing a tattoo from her right thigh, and severing her left arm at the elbow. He later took the arm, reportedly using it for his own perverse gratification. Gillis wrote to a close friend of Johnston, Tammy Pepera, describing the murder in chilling detail. "He was so drunk that night. I don't think she knew what was happening to her. Honestly, her last words were, 'I can't breathe.'" In these letters, Lee seemed to struggle with understanding his own actions, admitting he didn't know why he committed such atrocities. He said he had no love, no compassion, no faith, no mercy, no hope, at the time blaming his violence on his hatred for God. Donna's body was discovered with clear evidence that linked her to Gillis. DNA evidence found at the scene, along with tire tracks, eventually led to his arrest. At the time of his capture, police found 45 digital photographs on Gillis's computer, many showing Johnston's dismembered body, as well as photos of the other victims. Despite her tragic end, Johnston was remembered as someone who, despite her mistakes, cared deeply for her family and even strangers. She was a person who, though troubled by addiction, still had a heart full of love for those around her. On March 3, 2004, a task force was formed to investigate the murders of Donna Bennett Johnston, Johnny Mae Williams, and Catherine Hall, along with other similar unsolved homicides in the Baton Rouge area. With the arrest of serial killer Derek Todd Lee the previous year, investigators feared that there could be additional killers at large, especially as certain murders did not seem to match Lee's patterns. On April 28, 2004, DNA swabs were collected. Tire tracks found near Donna Johnston's body were traced to a rare Goodyear tire model, which became a key lead in the investigation. Authorities compiled a list of people who owned vehicles with this specific tire and began collecting DNA samples from them. Sean Gillis was among those approached. He voluntarily provided a DNA sample, which was later matched to DNA found on the victims' bodies. On April 29, 2004, came the arrest of Sean Gillis. With the DNA match in hand, police moved quickly. SWAT teams broke down the door of Gillis's home, where he was arrested in front of his girlfriend, Terry Lemoyne. When she questioned what was happening, Gillis simply said, "Sorry, honey bunny." Later that day, he confessed to the murders, and a search warrant was executed on his house. When police searched Gillis's home, they found disturbing evidence, including photographs of his victims, various weapons such as saws and knives, a machete, plastic zip ties, and external hard drives containing unsettling files. Some files were titled "Best of Snuff," "Beheadings and Hangings," and "Manson Murders." Investigators also found books and materials related to serial killers, including a file titled DTL, with news and information about Derek Todd Lee, Gillis's fellow serial killer. These items provided further insight into Gillis's obsession with violence and death. On May 4, 2004, Gillis would confess to Marilyn Neville's murder. investigators in Lafayette, unaware of Neville's disappearance, were notified of her murder. This discovery added another layer to the investigation, prompting a deeper search into Gillis's past crimes. On June 10, 2004, came the indictment for Donna Bennett Johnston's murder. Gillis was formally indicted for the murder of Donna Bennett Johnston, with the prosecution seeking the death penalty. Gillis was also indicted for the murder of Joyce Williams, a crime he would later plead guilty to in August 2004, resulting in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Gillis's trial for the murder of Donna Bennett Johnston began in Baton Rouge on July 21, 2008. The prosecution presented evidence linking him to the crime, including testimony from Lauren Keller, who had seen what appeared to be a body near the Ben-Hur Canal the morning Johnston was murdered. On the second day of the trial, Nicholas Murphy, a deputy who had transported Gillis, testified that Gillis had admitted to using flex cuffs as his weapon of choice. Further forensic evidence, including DNA matching Gillis to hair found on the victims, was presented. In closing arguments, the prosecution asked the jury to find Gillis guilty of first-degree murder. The jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict, convicting Gillis for the murder of Johnston. The jury then moved to the penalty phase of the trial. Prosecutor Prem Burns introduced evidence of other murders Gillis had committed, further detailing the extent of his crimes. Despite the chilling nature of the evidence, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty. As a result, Gillis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On February 17, 2009, Gillis pled guilty to the first-degree murder of Marilyn Nevels and was sentenced to another life sentence in prison. The disturbing confessions of the other Baton Rouge serial killer. Once in custody, Sean Vincent Gillis swiftly confessed to his murders, revealing a chilling blend of pride and remorse. During his interviews, he switched between laughing while recounting his brutal acts and expressing sorrow for the pain he had caused. His words were chilling, yet disturbingly honest. "I'm sorry I hurt people, but I would do it again," Gillis stated coldly. "You let me out on the street, I'll find somebody before sundown." In an eerily detached moment, he added, "If anything in my useless life comes out, help the little girls today not to be the premature corpses of tomorrow." With his confessions in hand, authorities charged Sean Vincent Gillis with multiple murders. He was eventually convicted of 7 of the 8 murders he admitted to, and sentenced to several life terms in prison. While incarcerated, Gillis continued to express regret for his actions, particularly in correspondence with a friend of his final victim, Donna Johnston. In one of these letters, he once again showed remorse, but his words also carried the cold tone of a hardened, meticulous killer. The underlying motivations behind Gillis's horrific crimes remain complex, and it is difficult to pinpoint a singular reason for his descent into violence. Despite having an absent father, his childhood appeared fairly normal. However, during questioning by District Attorney Burns, Gillis made a startling admission. He confessed to having sexual fantasies about his mother, a woman who both angered and doted on him throughout his life. "I wanted to have sex with my mother," he said, a statement that added an unsettling layer to his twisted psyche. In May 2004, FBI agents interviewed Gillis, where he described his killings with unsettling calm. Gillis likened the investigation into his crimes to a game of chess, boasting, "I was the chess master. Then, you're not going to beat me." He explained how he used the media to assess his progress, stating that he would evaluate news reports to gauge the success of his crimes. "My basic interest would be, okay, did they find it? Where did they find it? What was the condition of the body?" Gillis also described how he used charm and money to lure his victims into his car, bragging, "The hookers loved me. I treated them like women, like ladies." Though he didn't have a set schedule for his murders, he described the murders as opportunistic, committed when the chance presented itself. He spoke of carefully selecting body disposal sites, stating, "You're not going to dump a body if it's going to leave tracks. It's preferable to dump before it rains. It washes evidence off the victim and the evidence around the crime scene." Despite his chilling confessions, Gillis later wrote a letter to Tammy, a woman close to one of his victims, expressing his regret, though his words were often contradictory. "I cannot express how beyond sorry I am for murdering Donna, Johnny May, Lillian, Marilyn, Joyce, Hardy, Catherine, and Anne," he wrote. "For your own sake, Tammy, you must forgive the sinner, but you may hate the sin forever." He continued describing his encounter with Donna Johnston. "We did not talk much, just about price and for what, you know. There were no advances. Sex was not my intent. I was pure evil that night." Gillis admitted to the dissonance between his feelings of remorse and his actions, writing, "I really don't know what the hell is wrong with me. Until 10 years ago, I never so much as imagined harm to anyone." At the conclusion of one letter, Gillis made a rare statement that conveyed some degree of sorrow and self-awareness. "I don't want to die, but that is up to the Almighty to decide. I love my wife and stepchildren. I now know that I really love them, that God loves me, and I love him." Gillis's disturbing confessions offer a glimpse into the mind of a killer, one who, despite moments of regret, remained a cold, calculating predator. His letters, confessions, and chilling words continue to haunt those who are left to wonder what truly drove him to take the lives of so many innocent victims. Sean Vincent Gillis has been incarcerated at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, commonly known as Angola, since 2008. Now 60 years old, he remains in maximum custody housing within the prison's preventative segregation unit. This specialized housing arrangement, requested by Gillis himself, is due to his status as a high-profile inmate and a labeled serial killer. The communications director for the Louisiana Department of Public Safety and Corrections explains that preventative segregation is designed for inmates whose presence in the general population would threaten the safety and order of the facility. Preventative segregation is a maximum custody housing area, preferably a cell, which may be necessary because an offender's continued presence in general population is a danger to the good order and discipline of the facility, and/or whose presence poses a danger to himself, other offenders, staff, or the general public. This was shared in a statement to A&E True Crime. According to Burke Foster, an expert in Angola's history, preventative segregation operates in two locations within the prison. One is the Camp F death row complex, housing 38 of the most egregious inmates. The other is Camp D, which holds an additional 78 inmates, bringing the total to 116. For security reasons, authorities have not disclosed Gillis's specific location within the facility. Unlike many Angola inmates who participate in work details, Gillis is not permitted to work due to his housing status. While he is eligible to take classes, he has reportedly chosen not to do so. Preventative segregation confines Gillis to his cell for most of the day, a level of isolation that some experts argue can have severe psychological consequences. Preventative segregation wouldn't change the potential severe consequences of being isolated for so long, notes De La Torre, a commentator on prison conditions. However, Gillis's apparent narcissism and ego strength may insulate him from fully understanding or being affected by his circumstances. Sean Vincent Gillis's arrest brought an end to a reign of terror that left a deep scar on Baton Rouge. His case serves as a grim reminder of the hidden darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. Today, Gillis is serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole, ensuring he can never harm anyone again. While his story is one of unimaginable horror, it also underscores the importance of vigilance and community awareness in protecting the vulnerable. Thank you for joining me on Serial Sleep. Wishing you a peaceful night and sweet dreams despite our chosen genre.